to stand and speak somewhat huskily on the Sentencing and Parole Reform Bill.
Very sexy.
John Key's national-led government, as we know, is principled, pragmatic, and seeking to find solutions to the many challenges facing our country. We are keeping our promises. We promised and we are taking action on combating violent crime and making families safer in their homes and communities. This bill is part of a raft of legislation we have brought to the House. Legislation to toughen sentences, parole and bail for violent offenders, crack down on gangs and and to support victims of crime. We have also initiated Fresh Start programs. Fresh Start programs, Mr. Speaker, almost 3,000 young offenders last year benefited from interventions to turn them away from a life of crime. We recognise that drug and alcohol addiction is at the root cause of much crime, and we have increased the access to drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs. We have recognised the woeful undermanning of the police under the previous lacklustre, lackadaisical, unlamented Labor administration, and have already deployed over 200 more police in the Manukau-Manurewa area where I have the privilege of being based. 100 more will be deployed by the end of 2010 and 300 more nationwide by the end of next year. Along with initiatives in health, social policy, education and addressing the drivers of crime, those are some of the areas of the enmesh which we will be reshaping in our effort to make our communities more secure. We have heard some criticism from the opposition, but how useful were their policies to reduce crime? In fact, some may say, did they have any policies? Well, you may well ask. I believe they did, but how useful was it? How useful was it in reducing crime, making New Zealanders feel safer in their homes and on their streets? Judging by what I saw walking the streets of Manurewa in 2008, not very useful. People had 3 locks on their doors, and on the screen outside, 2 more doors. Not very useful. How useful, you might say? As useful, perhaps, as useful as a cricketer's box to a ballerina, Mr. Chairman. As useful as a drink of water to a drowning man, Mr. Speaker. As useful to a sun as a sun hat at midnight. This bill, Mr. Speaker, this bill, the Sentencing and Parole Reform Bill, as I said, part of the national-led government's raft of measures to make our communities safer. And let's not ignore the fact, Mr. Speaker, it puts the interests of victims and the wider community ahead of the interests of our worst and most serious violent offenders. This bill is aimed at the minority of offenders who, even after receiving 2 previous warnings, continue to offend in a serious, violent way. These people have demonstrated they will not change, and for those few people, there is no alternative but to prevent them from offending in such a way that they no longer present a danger to law-abiding men and women living in our communities. None of the 41 qualifying offences for the street hikes are relatively minor offences. All involve serious violence or sexual offending, and all have a maximum penalty of at least 7 years in prison. In defending the rights of offenders, critics of 3 strikes downplay the goal of legislation, which is to protect the public from criminals who have a track record, Mr. Speaker, of serious offending. These are not poor, innocent, unfortunately dealt with by the state. This bill focuses on the repeat nature of offending rather than just the offence itself. Critics of 3 strikes may also argue that offenders do not consider the consequences of their actions when they commit crime. They didn't know what they were doing, Mr. Speaker. That longer sentences are not an effective deterrent. The road to a 3rd strike is a long one, which involves clear warnings delivered by a judge about the consequences of further serious offending and considerable time in prison where it is hoped they will reflect on their actions. When making a choice of whether to commit a third serious crime, offenders will have a very good idea of what is in store for them. Mr Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Order. I call Hani Harawira.